It's part two of our off-season college football preview next on Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deeper into the corner. Waits for it. It's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Jameson.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it, get it, touchdown, Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him, and a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle, caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet, touchdown Michigan. On its way. It's good. He's 5'7". 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Second. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic. Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace. Welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. It is part two of our off-season college football preview. Last week, if you missed it right here on our channel on YouTube or on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play, we took a look at the off-season strictly from a Maize and Blue perspective, looking at it everything Michigan football and what are the storylines to be following over the next, say, 200 some odd days until the Wolverines storm into South Bend for the opener of the 2018 season. Yes, of course, it is Michigan Podcast. We'll talk some Wolverines this week too, but our primary focus shifts a little bit more globally. We'll look at the biggest storylines, both in the Big Ten and nationally in college football, that if you're a Michigan fan or any college football fan, you're going to be looking and following over the course of the next 7 months. Helping us through this journey, Bill Bender of the Sporting News. He's their national college football writer. He'll be joining us a little bit later on as well. We'll even take a look at the coaching carousel. Who were the best coaching hires, the worst ones, and the ones that the jury is still out. We'll debate all of that and more on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. But first, I want to invite you, if you haven't yet subscribed to our channel here on YouTube, we would greatly appreciate it if you would. Leave us a positive comment, positive review, especially if you're a subscriber on Stitcher or iTunes. People do pay attention to how many good reviews somebody has. That would be a huge benefit to us. Now, if you don't like what we do, we wouldn't tell you to lie. Just, like your mama said, if you got nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. Just kind of keep that knowledge to yourself, all right? But if you do dig how we finger roll here on the Michigan Podcast, help us help you get the word out by giving us a like and a positive review. Thank you very much. So over the course of the next 7 months, I think there are 8 questions that are going to be dominating the off-season headlines in college football. We're going to look at each one of those one by one to open this week's episode, and it begins here. What is going to be the fallout at Michigan State? What's going on right now with Sparty is you have your own Penn State. In this case, it's not Jerry Sandusky, it's Dr. Larry Nassar. That's evolved into its own Baylor, except now it's not just the football program, but the men's basketball program as well. ESPN's Outside the Lines reporting that Mark D'Antonio, contrary to what he told us last June, this isn't his first go-around with sexual assault at Michigan State. It was a 16th, actually. In one of those cases, ESPN alleged He urged a player to call his mother and express how he was ashamed at what he was alleged to have done. Needless to say, this ongoing story puts the coaching futures of both Tom Izzo and Mark D'Antonio in doubt, which could put what I think, on paper anyway, looks like a promising Michigan State football season in doubt as well. That is a story we're going to be following throughout the offseason, as will be this one. Does Alabama have a quarterback controversy? For the first official time in 2018, let me attempt to say it right. Tua Tagovailoa. See, you can do it if you say it slowly. Except that's like the first time I've ever gotten it right, so maybe you can't. Jalen Hurts is a lot easier to say. He was the Southeastern Conference's Offensive Player of the Year as a true freshman quarterback, but of course, the rest, as they say, is history. He was benched at halftime of the national championship game, and the legend of Tua began. Alabama, does it have a full-fledged controversy at quarterback? That's something we'll be following this offseason as well. The third question, does Georgia have a quarterback controversy? Now, some of you are like, well, hey, Steve, Jacob Eason, Tony Eason's kid, he's moved on. He's going to the University of Washington, where he'll take over in 2 years after Browning finishes out his senior year at the Huskies this fall. Well, I'm not talking about Jacob Eason and Jake Fromm. I'm talking about Jake Fromm and Justin Fields, who some analysts are saying is the best quarterback to come out of the high school ranks in recent memory. The 5-star quarterback signed with Georgia, and he didn't go to Athens to ride the pine. So Jake Fromm just got out of a quarterback controversy, finds himself right back in another one. Speaking of quarterback controversy, so you're noticing a common theme here. Elite programs that could be facing quarterback quandaries. Well, many of you are like, Steve, Clemson, Kelly Bryant was a revelation. Took over for Deshaun Watson, led him back to the playoff. Yeah, except did you watch their offense when they took on Alabama in the playoff? Didn't look like it did the last 2 years when Deshaun Watson had over 800 yards passing, 8 touchdowns, and 1 interception in 2 playoff games against Alabama's mighty defense. Kelly Bryant and the entire Clemson offense looked lost. And if you're not a recruiting analyst who thinks Justin Fields is the best high school quarterback coming in this fall, you probably think Clemson's Trevor Lawrence is. Also, Clemson brought in who a lot of people thought was the number 1 high school quarterback last year. He's still sitting there as well. So wouldn't shock me at all if Kelly Bryant, even though he's the entrenched starter, sees himself in a battle for playing time this offseason at quarterback. Another question we'll be following this offseason. Is there anybody on campus that can play Scott Frost's style of football? Because Nebraska was in the process of transitioning its roster again to play the former coach's pro-style conventional attack. So, who's the trigger man? I mean, one thing we've learned as Michigan fans with this spread offense, right? We learned it the first year with Rich Rod. We went 3-9. It doesn't matter how good you are anywhere else. And we had a pretty good defense that year. Brandon Graham, one of the best pass rushers in the NFL, was an All-American on our defense in 2009. I'm sorry, in 2008. But we had Stephen Threet, Nick Sheridan at quarterback, guys that just could not play this system. So this offense, if you have a playmaking quarterback, is really tough to stop. And if you don't, it's really easy to stop. So we'll be watching this offseason as we find out, is the roster ready to play Scott Frost's more Oregon style of football this fall? Next question to watch over the offseason. Who was the coach saver coordinator hire? The last 2 years, I think we've seen coordinators hired that probably saved their head coaches' jobs. You had Mike Elko, brought over from Wake Forest to be defensive coordinator at Notre Dame. Probably saved Brian Kelly's job. The year before, Joe Moorhead brought in to be the offensive coordinator for a stagnant Penn State offense. May have saved James Franklin's job. Who is that hot coordinator hire this offseason? Remember, last year, Matt Canada was supposed to be that guy for LSU. He only lasted 1 year. He's at Maryland now, so he's here in the Big Ten. We're going to face him at Michigan later this fall. One question we Michigan fans will be dealing with a lot from the media. Is it put up or shut up time for Jim Harbaugh? There's already an article at ESPN today Where's Harbaugh at in the recruiting rankings? Why isn't he climbing trees? Why isn't he spending the night? Pardon me. Why'd they get rid of the signing of the stars? Is the bloom off the rose? We're going to hear this storyline a lot. And the only thing that will make it go away is beating someone in a meaningful game. We get our first chance to do that right out of the chute against Notre Dame. And then the final story to be looking at this offseason. What's going to be the surprise? Now, it's possible Michigan State is already that surprise. Nobody saw that story coming. But remember we woke up last June and found out Bob Stoops retired out of the blue at Oklahoma, still seemingly in the prime of his career, right? That's a story nobody saw coming. So what is the offseason story that we can't even begin to predict will happen right now? That's another storyline to watch over the next 200 days. When we come back, Bill Bender from the Sporting News. He's going to answer these questions too. Next. If you're not yet a Patreon supporter for Michigan Podcast, take a look at what you missed immediately following Michigan's huge win over Michigan State. We had an instant reaction podcast for our supporters, breaking it all down right there at patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. And again, we want to thank all of you who helped to cover some of the costs, the overhead it takes to produce this, really, for YouTube anyway, a high-level production, the graphics and everything else. You know, as my old college roommate Mike Bartram used to say, romance without finance, a damn nuisance, right? So, I mean, someone had to pay for all the equipment, and someone had to supply the mediocre talent that you are watching right now. So thank you to those of you on our Patreon page that are contributing to help make this possible. And you too can contribute as well and get extra special content exclusively for you by being one of our Patreon supporters. And now it's time for a second opinion here on Michigan Podcast. Joining us now, he is the national college football writer for the Sporting News. Bill Bender is here with us on Michigan Podcast. How are you, Bill?
I'm doing well, Steve. Thanks for having me on, as always.
By the way, I like the blue shirt, man. It's cool. It's a nice look.
I'm sure you do. Heading over to cover a basketball game at Ohio State. I don't know if they'll like the blue shirt at Ohio State tonight, but we'll leave that conversation for another day. Chicks
dig guys in blue shirts. That's what I've been told. Actually, I just told I'm not sure that's true. I just told myself that, but I'm going with it. So there you go. All right. So we've got we just ran down a list of questions that I think are going to dominate college football's offseason over the next 200 some odd days. And I want to run down that list again, but I want to get your take on these questions, if you don't mind. Let's start there. You ready?
I'm ready.
Let's start with question number 1. What is the fallout going to be at Michigan State? And here's what I think is one of these two things is true, Bill. Either ESPN is guilty of finding a journalistic rock bottom even more contemptible than Rolling Stone went to with Duke and UVA a few years ago, or I think it's very likely at some point in the near future, you're going to see new head coaches in football and men's basketball at Michigan State. I think it's one of those two possibilities. But what's your take on this story? Because obviously, when you're talking about a team bringing back 20 starters from a 10-win team, and the head coach's future is potentially in peril, that's a major college football story in terms of results on the field beyond the tragedy that's obviously involved here.
Yeah, I think the toughest part as a reporter over the last few days is, one, the gymnastics scandal with Larry Nassar, the 100 or so victims. You've got to, have empathy for them first. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the most important thing. But now with the ESPN investigative piece, it does rope in football and basketball, and that is separate from gymnastics, but it still falls under the umbrella of the Michigan State Athletic Department. With Mark Hollis already out, you have to wonder, we're talking about two of the biggest leaders in school history in Tom Izzo and Mark D'Antonio. I think Mark D'Antonio is 50-50 right now because, as you said, it's that line between the line that he drew by saying the report is false is ESPN wrong, or will somebody find something else that's kind of that straw that pushes the mob towards pushing Mark D'Antonio out before the 2018 season starts?
Next question that I think our audience is going to be following a lot this offseason. Do we have a quarterback controversy at mighty Alabama, Bill? What say you?
I don't think they have a controversy. I think Tua's Tagovailoa. I gotta stop and say that.
I can do it if I say
it
really slow. Tonga Viola. I've got to say it really slow, though. Really slow.
Tonga Vailoa. I think he'll start. I think the bigger question is, what are they going to do with Jalen Hurts? Because it feels a little bit like Cardale Jones a few years ago at Ohio State, where you can't sit a guy that just won you a national championship. So it'll be interesting. I think, what do they do with Jalen Hurts now? Does he switch positions? Does he transfer? How does the spring football work with these two quarterbacks? I think that's the next big question they're going to ask.
It's probably too obvious, but Jalen Hurts, Florida Atlantic with his old offensive coordinator, lighting up group of 5 defenses. Listen, I know he's not the polished passer Tua is. We're still talking about a young man who is a physical specimen, who was the SEC Offensive Player of the Year as a true freshman, who still outran that Clemson defensive line of all first-rounders for what we thought was a game-winning touchdown with about 30 seconds to go in the national championship 2 years ago. Could you imagine what he would do in that offense against defenses at that level?
That's a good point, because, I mean, remember, Steve, 25-2 as a starter, highly talented kid. And, you know, with Lane Kiffin, here was a guy that was a candidate for so many jobs this offseason. He stays put, and you have to wonder, is he trying to build this group of 5 buster that's not just going to do it for 1 year? Is this Lane Kiffin's plan? And a guy like Jalen Hurts would certainly fit there. But I don't think the drama is who's going to start. I think the drama is what happens with Jalen Hurts.
All right. Is there a quarterback controversy? That's our next question. At the school that Alabama defeated for the national championship. Now, of course, Jacob Eason has moved on to Washington, so that's an excellent situation for Huskies and their fans. They get Jake Browning back for his senior year, and you go right next to another 5-star recruit waiting in the wings who takes over in 2019. But Justin Fields, I mean, I read some stuff heading into this season. You know, people who have recruiting analysts who are known, like Tom Luganbill, to have, you know, sane opinions, talking about this might be the best quarterback recruit they've ever scouted, one of the best in recent memory. He goes to Georgia. He ain't going there to sit on the bench there, Bill. And you got Jacob Fromm, obviously, who was a revelation as a freshman, taking Georgia literally one play from a national championship. How's that going to play itself out?
That's really interesting, and because, like you said, it shouldn't be a quarterback controversy when you're talking about a guy that I thought the national championship game was over when Jake Fromm threw that 80-yard touchdown pass. I seriously thought, okay, that's a ball game, Georgia wins. But Fields is that talented. So what I think will happen is Fromm will start, at least early in the season. They'll have a package of plays to get Fields involved, you know, whether it's running the football, you know, throwing the ball. And they're not tested real early in the schedule anyway. So I think that's something to watch for. Fromm starts, Fields pushes for time, and then you have to wonder if it's going to be like that Deshaun Watson situation at Clemson a few years ago where eventually he just takes over. Very interesting considering how close Georgia was to winning it all.
It's amazing, though, in the case of Deshaun Watson, he was taking over for a placeholder, right? The guy who wasn't good enough to beat the incumbent starter and was his perennial backup. We're talking about a guy who was a force of nature from the moment he started in spring football, who clearly outperformed Jacob Eason, if you watched Georgia last spring, as a true freshman, in and of himself was considered a consensus national top 50 recruit in the class of 2017. He's just beginning to develop as a player. This is not your typical situation where the hot shot takes over eventually for the placeholder. Jacob Fromm is like, dude, I'm the hot shot, man. Are you kidding me? I just got here. I think that's going to be fascinating how Georgia navigates those waters, Bill.
Yeah, and this is a year where there's going to be a lot of those. You already mentioned Alabama. There's a couple more playoff contenders with quarterbacks to replace. But Fromm interests me because I saw kind of what you were just talking about, a guy that was good in the spring, really took hold of the job with that start at Notre Dame, led a game-tying drive for a score in the Rose Bowl, in the highest pressure situation possible, and again, played well against Alabama in that championship game. So I'll confess, I haven't seen as much of Fields as some of the recruiting experts who have certainly broken him down a lot more. But, man, it's going to take a heck of an effort just to unseat Fromm and to begin with.
Another school that's a major playoff contender, and I would have number one if I had to vote in a preseason poll today, is Clemson. I think they could be looking at a quarterback controversy. They signed what a lot of people thought was the best high school quarterback in the country in 2017. The people who didn't think Justin Fields was the number one person in this class at quarterback in 18 think Trevor Lawrence is. And Kelly Bryant, we finally saw, we kept waiting for a reality check, waiting for Clemson's offense to kind of come back to earth with the loss of Deshaun Watson and all the weapons that he had around him, and that suddenly that they would finally pay the price for all of those losses. We saw against Alabama, there was a bit of a difference from Deshaun Watson facing Nick Saban twice and throwing for over 800 yards combined and 8 touchdowns to 1 interception to what Kelly Bryant was able to do in that circumstance. Could he be looking out his rearview mirror this offseason, Bill?
Yes. And I always use this story. When I covered Clemson last year, I went to the Louisville game, which was, if you remember, it was early in September.
That was kind of Kelly Bryant's coming out party, right?
Exactly, and it should have been, but I'm in the press conference afterward, and there are reporters talking about Trevor Lawrence. That's how big of a deal this guy is. And then, the way, like you said, Bryant plays against Alabama, that's one spring game I'm probably the most intrigued by, because I want to see if Lawrence truly is ready to take that job, because I think that's the impact of what Tua did at Alabama. He has Georgia reevaluating quarterback. He probably has Clemson reevaluating quarterback. I think it extends all the way up to the Big Ten at Ohio State and Michigan, who we'll talk about in a bit, obviously. But everybody's going to be reevaluating quarterback, because I think Tua Tagovailoa is college football's next big megastar.
Helmet sticker. You nailed it. You crushed it. And you didn't have to slow down phonetically like I still have to do to pronounce it. Next question for the offseason for Bill Bender of the Sporting News, who's our guest this week on Michigan Podcast. Is there anybody on campus right now that can play Scott Frost style of football? Now, I'll say this, man. When you take over a new region in a new conference, and in a month, he has a consensus top 25 recruiting class right now. There's just no way to spin it, even for me as a Michigan fan. That is damned impressive. But as a Michigan fan, I have a little experience with trying to change over from a pro-style attack to a spread without an obvious trigger man on campus who can run that offense. And everybody goes back to Rich Rod's first year when we lost to Toledo at home. It's the still the only time we've ever lost to a MAC foe. We went 3-9. People forget our defense that year was really good. Brandon Graham was on that defense. We just couldn't move the football across the street with Stephen Threet and Nick Sheridan on offense. We couldn't run Rich Rod's spread attack. This is the same offense that Scott Frost runs. It's right. It's cut from the same cloth. And this is like the 4th roster transition Nebraska's done. They did from Solich to Callahan, then from Callahan back to Pelini, from Pelini to the pro style attack they just got rid of, and now they're going to a hyper spread attack that's more of a Rich Rod, Chip Kelly, Oregon kind of an offense. Where do they have the players on campus this fall that can run this scheme, Bill?
Yeah, there'll be growing pains. And I know the honeymoon at Nebraska right now feels like it did in Ann Arbor a few years ago when Jim Harbaugh arrived. And I think there will be parallels in terms of how Nebraska competes in the Big Ten West. I will say this about Scott Frost, though, and you probably remember this game. When they played Michigan a few years ago, when he was at UCF, it was an early season game in September, and I saw a team that played over its head against Michigan. Michigan had trouble running the football against them. I mean, the scoreboard doesn't tell the whole story there, and I think that's what he'll bring to Nebraska in year one. Will it be enough to take over Wisconsin in the Big Ten West? I don't know. I think it's going to take a year or two to bring the players in, and it'll be interesting to see how long that honeymoon lasts, because again, Jim Harbaugh came in, won 10 games right away, but that almost raised the bar, I think in some ways unfairly, as we're going to talk about here soon, about what to expect in Ann Arbor moving forward.
Next question to watch over the course of the offseason. Who's the coach saver coordinator hire, Bill? And I'll give you a couple examples of guys that I think played a huge role in either saving their head coach's job or helping him establish himself. I go to Joe Moorhead 2 years ago when Penn State, went from an offense that Christian Hackenberg hated his head coach, James Franklin, so much he thanked everybody on campus for his time at Penn State except him. And their offense was dreadful the first couple of years under Franklin, even though he's an offensive guy. Joe Moorhead comes in. You know how the world found out Michigan safeties couldn't cover man-to-man? Yeah, we found that out courtesy of Joe Moorhead in that game in the whiteout at Penn State in Happy Valley where we got massacred. All right, so losing him, I think, is a blow. And then I go to what Mike Elko did last year for Wake Forest, coming from Wake Forest for Notre Dame. And you look at how terrible Notre Dame was defensively. Now, they weren't great last year, but they were respectable. They actually could hold up to give the offense time to actually run Brian Kelly's scheme. That's a huge loss for Notre Dame. And I think he went a long way in helping Brian Kelly reverse from 4-8 to 9-3 this past season. Who is that guy that was just brought in that you see coming down the pike for 2018, Bill?
I think Brian Van Gorder is going to help a lot at Louisville. That was a recent hire. Their defense was bad. They were soft on that side of the ball, and I think there's a window of opportunity at Louisville paired with their offense with Bobby Petrino. I think Jawan Pass is going to take over for Lamar Jackson. That's not going to be easy. But Louisville has an opportunity to be that team that challenges Clemson. I mean, if you look at Florida State, new coach. If you look at the rest of that division, NC State's okay, but we're kind of used to seeing what they're going to do. I think that's the one, at least that I've seen, and granted that happened very recently, that is one of those jobs that I think Louisville, like I said, they've got that opportunity. Van Gorder's got a decent resume. I know he's been tossed around a little bit, but he did okay at Notre Dame for at least a few years.
What do you make of Matt Canada? Because he's coming to our league now. He's going to go work for our old defensive coordinator, DJ Durkin, as his OC at Maryland. And this guy was supposedly the coach saver coordinator hire at this time last year, right? He was going to coach the offense for Ed Orgeron. He's on his fourth job in 6 years. Have you ever seen a guy, and two of those jobs at NC State and at LSU, he was fired. Have you ever seen a guy get more pub and more hype who can't keep a job, Bill?
I think some of that's a reflection of LSU, though. The unsteady environment that's going on there right now with Ed Orgeron flipping through coordinators, a lot of instability even dating back to Les Miles. I do think bringing him to the Big Ten's interesting because Maryland, before they had quarterback after quarterback after quarterback get injured, was a very interesting team. It's one that hung half 100 on Texas last season in Austin. So, yeah, I think his track record with quarterbacks is pretty good. And, Maryland, you've got to do something different because if you look at how, as you and I both know, that Big Ten East is so loaded that very rarely does Maryland, Rutgers, Indiana beat any of the other four schools.
Next question for Bill Bender of the Sporting News that we're going to be following this offseason. Is it put up or shut up time for Jim Harbaugh? I listen to a lot of college football podcasts and shows around the country. And, I mean, he is everybody's favorite whipping boy. I think, for example, Barrett Sallee is one of the best college football reporters in the country, present company included. But, man, that dude he has a Harbaugh-gasm every time I turn him on. He looks for ways to bash Jim Harbaugh, and right now as a fan, I just got to keep my mouth shut because we're not winning a lot of very significant games right now. So what's your read on this situation? Because even when Jim goes quiet, Tom Van Haren at ESPN has a story today. Where's Jim Harbaugh? Why isn't it climbing trees, doing sleepovers? Has he given up? We're not having the signing of the stars, right? So this is going to be a story talked a lot about the next 7 months. So what's your read on it, Bill?
I always take the middle ground with Jim Harbaugh, and I have since day one. You've had me on here a few times, and I think I'm the voice of reason between the social media hype and the social media criticism, because I do think of all the criticisms of Jim Harbaugh, the talking about finishing third in the Big Ten East, I don't care about that. I don't care what he does on the recruiting trail. I actually think it's cool that he takes his players over to places like Rome and Paris and wherever. I don't know what college kid wouldn't take that trip. So to me, it comes down to one thing and one thing only. The only criticism that lands right now is they got to beat Ohio State. Because I think beating Ohio State unlocks everything else. We won't be talking about how bad the offense is. It would mean that Shea Patterson was somewhat of an answer at quarterback, that they're better up front. The offensive line was really bad last year. They have to be better up front. And, look at the schedule. I know you have. That's the toughest schedule I've seen. I mean, who's playing, let me get this right, at Notre Dame, at Michigan State, at Ohio State, at home against Nebraska, Penn State, and Wisconsin? There's no team in the country, I think, that can go 12-0 against that. So I think 10 wins, 11 at best, would be a remarkable season for Jim Harbaugh in year 4.
Final question, Bill, to look at this offseason. What's the X factor? Like that day last June, we all woke up and Bob Stoops walks away and what we still think is the prime of his career. What is that story that's going to shake us up the next 7 months that we just don't see coming right now?
Well, I think it already happened with D'Antonio, and I do think the one bold prediction I'm already kind of keying in on for next season, I think Texas really takes off with Tom Herman. I think that's the shakeup among the blue bloods, because that's who I look at. I look at schools as, is there a team that can challenge Alabama for the national championship? And I don't know if there's a school that really can next year, other than maybe Clemson. But I do think Texas is going to take the next step in the Big 12. I think they're going to challenge Oklahoma. I think Tom Herman's coming off this big recruiting class, and they're going to be the blue blood wake up. Because as you know, when a school like a Michigan or a Nebraska or USC, even last year we had that hype with Darnold. When they start to take off, it really takes off, and I think Texas is going to be that story next year. Now, don't record that, because if you replay this next year and I'm wrong, I don't want to hear it.
All right, so let's transition as we close this out with Bill Bender of the Sporting News. The coaching carousel, pending a Bob Stoops situation or what may or may not ultimately transpire at Michigan State, the coaching carousel in college football is largely done for 2018. Let's take a look at the major conference hires, and I've grouped them. I put them in 3 groups. Now, before we get to each group, I graded them. I put them in the group on the basis of, can I say right now with some level of certainty, and if you push back on me, can I defend my argument that this hire represents a clear upgrade? Doesn't mean I think he's a bad coach. If I don't think it's an upgrade, it may not mean I think he's a bad coach, but is this clearly an upgrade from what the school either got rid of or lost? Okay, so that's the way I'm looking at it. Is this an upgrade? So, Bill, here are the coaches I would buy right now that I think I can defend, and if you push back on me, I think I've got a counter argument for why I think these coaches are the clear upgrades. These are the head coaching hires in major college football that I would buy. Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M, clear upgrade in my view over Kevin Sumlin. Scott Frost in Nebraska, clear upgrade. Chip Kelly at UCLA, clear upgrade. Dan Mullen at Florida. I think those are unequivocally right now, sight unseen, before their teams take the field for the first time under their guidance in September. I'm buying them right now as clear upgrades. Agree or disagree?
No, I'm with you. That might not make for great podcasting, but I think the top 3 in particular were my 3 favorites. I really like Jimbo at Texas A&M. I think the Florida State job ran its course. It was just somewhere where he had to go somewhere else, and Texas A&M has a national championship caliber coach, and they can compete in the SEC West. We talked a little bit about Frost and what he brings to Nebraska. I think the most important thing is a sense of identity there. Kind of like with Harbaugh and Michigan again, just that there's pride in Nebraska football again. You mentioned it's already happening on the recruiting trail. I like Chip Kelly the best. I think because I know he can win in the Pac-12. I know that system works in the Pac-12. I know he can recruit Los Angeles. I know it's good to have him in college football. So I think all those things work. And I'm glad you threw Mullen on there, because Florida needs an offense. We saw that against Michigan last year, how bad the offense is, and they need a quarterback. And Dan Mullen knows quarterbacks. He knows Florida. I think it'll work out.
All right, these are the coaches I'm selling. Doesn't mean I think they're bad coaches. I just don't have the evidence in front of me that I think they are clear upgrades over what they had. I want to start with Mario Cristobal at Oregon. Kind of got a bad rap, for what he did at Florida. I think it was Florida International. But, man, when your players go to the administration and say, hire our OC, that's who we want. He's our guy. And then you go out there and just lay a freaking egg like that in the first game in the Las Vegas Bowl. Yikes. Okay, so and they didn't even really do a search. They really didn't even take a look at who else might be interested in that job. So I have Mario Cristobal on my sell list. Herm Edwards at Arizona State, which is literally the strangest hire of a coach I can ever remember in college football, including his press conference where he didn't seem to know that the school's mascot was a devil. And then Joe Moorhead at Mississippi State. I think Joe Moorhead's a terrific coach. Here's my argument for putting him on the sell list. I think Mississippi State, with what they have coming back, if Nick Fitzgerald overcomes the injury, he's healthy to go, he's a bigger Trace McSorley. Moorhead will do great with that team, I think, if Fitzgerald is healthy. And even the backup, what we saw in the bowl game, looks promising. I think this year, Mississippi State will still be about as good as they would have been with Dan Mullen. But, Bill, I really wonder about years 3 and 4 when a Yankee who's never been a head coach at this level ever and has no recruiting ties to a part of the country that is as cutthroat, and I'm saying that kindly, as you can imagine for talent. I really am skeptical when we get into year 3 and 4 and these now need to be his kids. I'm not sure he has what it takes to really recruit and run with the Sharks in the SEC. Your thoughts on my sell list?
Your biggest concern on Moorhead is mine too, the recruiting, the fit. Because I know he can coach. I know he's a great offensive mind. You saw that with Penn State. But I would worry, like you said, once Fitzgerald's gone, what's next? Can he really compete in that division? And I guess that's the great experiment. I would say of those 3 names, I'm the most intrigued by him, though, for sure, and giving him the leash. I think Edwards, great mentor for 18 to 22-year-old kids. Can't pick somebody much better than that, but also hasn't coached college football in 30 years. So that makes that just an off-the-wall hire, like you said. And then Cristobal, same thing. I mean, Oregon, this is how many transitions in 3 years? 3 in 3 years, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, so you need continuity. I guess they went with that with him. But they are a long way off from the team that competed, that was not competing for Pac-12 championships. I think even with Mark Helfrich, the year that they went to the playoff, it was a given that Oregon was going to be in the college football playoff hunt, and they are very far from that right now.
Finally, here's my hold list. Here are the guys that I just don't think we have the evidence to say these are clear upgrades. I like Chad Morris's pedigree, but I need to see, again, that he can recruit at a level that Arkansas can be more than a 7 or 8 win program as they tapped out with Brett Bielema. Jeremy Pruitt at Tennessee, we talked about how impressive it was the class Frost is putting together on the fly. He's got a class that is right now, a composite top 16 class. So you like his pedigree as well, but never been a head coach before. Kevin Sumlin at Arizona seems to do great early on, and that guy, I want him to buy my lottery ticket, Bill. Okay, I mean, he takes over at Houston right when he's got Case Keenum. He takes over at A&M right when they have Johnny Manziel. Now he's taking over at Arizona right when they have Khalil Tate. Okay, so the problem with Kevin Sumlin is never what goes on in year 1 and 2. It's what goes on in year 3 and after, when he's got to develop and find his own quarterback and build more of his own program. And then the other coach that's on my hold list is Willie Taggart at Florida State. Well, I think is a perfect fit. Obviously, I'm predisposed to like him. He's one of Harbaugh's best friends. He's a Florida State fan. He knows that part of the state well, and the whole state well. He'll crush it in recruiting. But the bar that Jimbo Fisher set was so high, I don't know that I've seen enough from Willie Taggart up until this point to think he would be a clear upgrade over what Jimbo Fisher did there. What do you think of my hold list?
No, it's good. Taggart, same concerns. I like him because he's young, can work with quarterbacks, energetic recruiter, has left every program he's been at in better shape than he found it, but he's not there to remodel Florida State. You're at Florida State to win national championships, and you're competing with Clemson, who in my mind right now, and I don't know if you would feel this way, but or follow the analogy, to me Clemson is kind of like 90s Florida State now.
Yeah.
They're a top 5 team every year.
Yep.
And that's the challenge for Taggart. Someone agree. I think Arizona, given what happened with Rich Rodriguez, couldn't have landed a better candidate at that part of the cycle, and it's a good fresh start for him. Pruitt and Morris are both interesting for different reasons. I think Pruitt, obviously, we all followed the whatever you want to call the Tennessee coaching search. There are so many adjectives I can't say how that went.
It was a poop show, Bill. Let's just say it. It was a total and complete poop show.
Yeah, but to land Pruitt, I mean, that's not bad. And, but again, my biggest concern there would be Tennessee doesn't want to be Alabama. They want to beat them. And it may take a while for Jeremy Pruitt to do that. And of those four, again, most intrigued by Chad Morris at Arkansas, because I know where Brett Bielema went wrong is if you're at Arkansas, you can't beat Alabama by trying to be Alabama. You got to do something different. Bobby Petrino did that at Arkansas.
Right.
And I think Chad Morris is going to do that at Arkansas. He did a good job flipping at SMU. I think they're going to throw it around, find some good receivers, and be an interesting team. So of those guys, I'm probably most intrigued by him.
All right, so final question for Bill Bender of the Sporting News. What are you going to be following this offseason? What do you have your eye on that we didn't ask you about, Bill?
Well, that's a good question. I think, just my usual blind spots are on the Big Ten. So I think, I'm looking at the Big Ten East. I think the one quarterback battle we didn't touch on is the one in Columbus, because when JT Barrett, I don't know if you're going to cut me off here, but no. JT Barrett being a 4-year starter, having Dwayne Haskins, Joe Burrow, and I know from being based in the area that Tate Martell's drawn a ton of interest. The kid from Las Vegas, social media interest. The highlights has that Johnny Manziel factor to him. So I think that's yet another quarterback battle that's going to define the Big Ten. And much like at Michigan, where if Michigan's starting Shea Patterson and Ohio State's starting Dwayne Haskins or Burrow or whoever, I think it just raises the stakes of what will be a very important game for both teams, because my bold prediction is, and it's not such a bold prediction generally, is that the winner of that game is going to win the Big Ten East and represent the Big Ten East in Indianapolis. So the big story is how those quarterbacks develop.
Great stuff, Bill. It's always a pleasure having you with us. You do fine work there at the Sporting News. Hope everybody watching us this week checks out your work there as well. God bless, brother. Thanks for joining us here on Michigan Podcast.
Hey, no problem, Steve. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. We'll be back with more in a minute. There's a look at The Athletic, our partners here on Michigan Podcast. Some of the best online sports commentary you'll find anywhere on the interwebs over at The Athletic. And right now, through our partners at Detroit Sports Podcast, you can get a discounted subscription to The Athletic. Promo code DSP, D as in David, SP as in Paul, DSP, promo code DSP at theathletic.com. Back here on Michigan Podcast, this week's Twitter question. We asked you, who is more important to keep on the Michigan football coaching staff, Chris Partridge or Dan Enos? 91% of you showed that you're lucid, and you know what you're talking about by voting correctly. The other 9% of you, I'm guessing, are members of the Enos family, and congratulations for having your voices heard. I mean, I'm guessing a lot of you are like, who's Dan Enos? Exactly. Our question, Ross Nanini writes, do you see Michigan pushing harder for in-state football recruits in the next class, 2019? It feels like a lot more are being offered. Is it a good year for in-state talent? Well, here's my general position on recruiting. All right. Everybody pretty much knows who the top 250 to 300 players are. Now, Rivals might have a kid 48th, and 24/7 might have him 79th, and ESPN might have him 158th. But they pretty much have all the same kids on the elite list. The real work is done after that. And I don't know how in the hell you can tell who the 68th best right guard is compared to the 75th. How do you know? I mean, how do you know where they're at academically? Do they have girlfriend problems? Their parents split up? Dad get relocated? There are so many mitigating factors that once you get beyond the elite kids, I just think you have to it becomes much more about player development, and does your staff have a history of that? So I'm gonna let others who know this better than I do judge how good the in-state crop is in 2019 in the state of Michigan. But I also, Ross, have noticed it does seem, since some of these new younger coaches were brought on staff, that the amount of scholarships being offered, the amount of shoe leather being invested in the recruiting process, it does seem like it's much more amped up than it was at this time early in the 2018 cycle. So I hope that is a good sign. We don't have to recruit at the elite level. Well, we did recruit at an elite level the last 2 years, but we don't have to be better or as highly ranked as Ohio State every year. But we can't have them consistently getting top 3 classes in the country, and we're at like 25th, okay? We've at least got to be in shouting distance in the hopes that different style that we play, ability to develop players, that our talent is close enough that we can compete with them. And I was concerned. I mean, we've missed out on a lot of the top recruits. When you see Ohio State come in for a kid like Tyler Friday, and we supposedly led for his recruitment for 3 months, and then all of a sudden, to the last minute, Ohio State comes in and takes that kid. And you can't tell me if Michigan had a season worthy of its preseason number 11 ranking, that kid wouldn't have eventually signed with us, because I think that he likely would have. So we've got to stay at least close enough to them in the hopes that we can eventually beat them. And that's how we can narrow the gap between them and us. And one way you do that is you got to outwork them. You have to get out there and get on kids earlier than I think we did in this last class. So I'm optimistic about that, which leads to this, by the way. Our next episode will come to you a day later. Next Wednesday is National Signing Day. We are not going to have an episode on Tuesday. We're going to do it a day later. It'll be up on iTunes and Stitcher and YouTube on Wednesday when the recruiting class is finalized. All right. So next week, we will take a look at Michigan's 2018 recruiting class and recruiting in the Big Ten as well. You do not want to miss that right here on Michigan Podcast. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast to keep up to date on what we think about all things Michigan in between episodes throughout the week. Want to thank our friends and partners at Detroit Sports Podcast for helping to get the word out about this show each week as well. We'll be back at it again next week. Until then, go Blue.